Welcome back to Let Us Think About It. I'm Ryder Richards. Today, we're diving into a rather provocative and challenging work. This is Ward Churchill's Pacifism as Pathology. So here's our metaphor. Picture a fortress, impenetrable and towering, representing the state's power. Its walls are built on violence and control, coercion and force. Now, imagine a group of protesters outside, holding candles and singing songs, waving placards, believing their moral purity will make those walls crumble. Now, what's happening is they're appealing to a moral conviction against established brutes. Churchill argues that this approach is not only ineffective, but a kind of delusion, a pathology that keeps us from real change. Now, this essay here, this little book, argues that the sanctimony of nonviolent activism is futile, or worse, it strengthens the fortress. So he maps its historical failures, why he sees it as a barrier to revolution, and the psychological delusions that it causes. So today we're going to cover his takedown or critique, and then next episode we're going to cover his proposed solution, and we're going to also bring in some current events and look at what Zizek calls the double blackmail. And most of this is around violence for social change. So this is kind of a heavy episode, and typically when we're confronted with any kind of argument that's against our sort of unexamined values, such as peace or the sanctity of the individual, people bulk up and they freeze and maybe even lash out, but of course not physically, because that's verboten. So just absorb this one today, and in the next episode, we're going to critique and expand the conversation. Part 1. Bio and Context. Ward Churchill is, of course, controversial. He's a scholar, activist, and writer known for his radical critiques of American imperialism, colonialism, and systemic oppression. As a former professor of ethnic studies at the University of Colorado, by the way, he was fired from there, and you can look that up if you want, Churchill's work often centers on indigenous rights, U.S. policies, and the shortcomings of political movements. So in Pacifism as Pathology, which was first published in 1986 and then expanded later, well, this all emerged from his frustration with the dominance of nonviolent tactics among North American progressive groups. So written as a response to his experiences in radical activism, the essay really challenges pacifism's sanctity, its kind of ideological grip, especially on academics and elites. And he argues it serves to maintain the status quo rather than dismantle it. So Churchill's willingness to kind of confront these liberal dogmas make him polarizing. But those provocations, well, they let us question our own blind assumptions. And I think if we're interested in social change, we seriously need to consider his critique. Now, for a little context around the time of when he was writing this, in the 80s, the U.S. was flexing its global muscle, right? We had Reagan's Cold War escalation, military interventions in Central America, and the rising conservatism. I mean, that was only matched by rising economic inequality. So progressive movements, I mean, those were still at the time shaped by the legacies of the 1960s, and this was anti-war and civil rights struggles. And they leaned very heavily on nonviolence as both a moral and strategic cornerstone. So heralding the victories of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., well, this change is still kind of held up as absolute proof that nonviolent resistance could indeed topple oppressive systems. But Churchill, drawing from his immersion once again in radical activism, the study of history, and perspective as an indigenous scholar, he argued that far from being revolutionary, pacifism often aligns with the state's interests, allowing it to maintain power unchallenged. Now, his critique takes in a broader scope, including global resistance, movements like those in South Africa, Central America, and Palestine, as well as looking at the before and after these nonviolent protests in order to get Americans to really confront the harsh realities of state power. Part 2. Critique. Pacifism, as we've said, defends the status quo, but also it hinders liberatory social transformation. And part of this is by offering an illusion of moral superiority. And I think that's where the real trap is. And unfortunately, Churchill points out that the cost is usually on those who are actually oppressed, who are not pacifist. Churchill calls pacifism a pathological illness. And like any pathology, it's irrationally rooted in delusion, historical revisionism, and moral contradictions. But of course, today we all know that peace is really the only correct answer we should give. So we end up tangling ourselves into knots trying to make it so, trying to make it believable. And Churchill confronts this, and he has three large topics that we're going to cover. And this is the lack of logic in pacifism or its delusion, pacifism as racism, and the suicidal tenets of pacifism. So we're going to begin here with the more academic critique, kind of walking through the contradictions, right? This is delusion, revisionism, and moral contradiction. So first off, pacifism as delusion. Churchill says pacifism is a fantasy, akin to medieval alchemy. It's a futile attempt to transmute lead into gold through wishful thinking. And he argues that pacifists operate under the delusion that the negativity of the modern corporate fascist state will atrophy through defection and neglect. That is, once a sufficiently positive social vision is presented, your positivity is going to count here, right? If you sing loudly enough, the fortress walls will crumble. Your positivity will melt hearts and change minds. Now, pacifists promise that the harsh realities of state power can be transcended via good feelings and purity of purpose, rather than by self-defense and resort to combat. Churchill says this insistence is consigned to the realm of fantasy, discarded by all but the most wishful or cynical. So the state here is inherently violent and self-preserving, and it's armed with big battalions, something we can't forget, right? The police, paramilitary, and other sort of military forces like the National Guard that help it maintain its dominance. So really what happens is once you move upon agreed upon pacifist rituals, out come the guns. Now, these kind of agreed upon tactics or actions for the pacifists are a relatively narrow band of ritual forms, like marches, sit-ins, and candlelight vigils. And yet pacifists assume or pretend that they can dictate the terms of struggle, while they're really just hamstringing themselves, which only ensures that the balance of physical power remains permanently with the state. And this, to Churchill, diminishes the possibility of social transformation to a point of non-existence. This, as he calls it, sublime arrogance, allows a state to thrive on empty actions, only making it stronger. And Churchill compares this to the arrogance of Lenin's flawed belief that the state would wither away under the right conditions. A delusion, he says, is doomed to failure by circumstance. And of course, we've all done this, right? Believed a convenient lie or fairy tale because we wanted it to be true, which is kind of a pathological hope. It's compulsive and irrational, yet we can build our lives around it. And Churchill suggests that this stems from a refusal to face unpleasant truths. Now, pacifists indulge in what he calls a comfort zone, where symbolic gestures, holding vigils, walking down streets, are false acts of solidarity, only pretending camaraderie with those engaged in actual armed struggle. This self-deception, he says, is marked by an overweening attitude of personal superiority among most pacifists who avoid physical risk or actual solidarity while claiming the moral high ground from afar. This reminds me a little of a master-slave dynamic, or maybe a sadist-masochist dynamic, where the slave or submissive actually declares that they have the power in the relationship, inverting their victim status, and then they intellectually and egotistically invert reality to claim that they're the real boss here. And yet, of course, they must continue to act out the role of the sub to maintain their fragile power. So his second point here, this historical contradictions, or you could also just consider this revising the past to justify the present. Well, Churchill says of this revisionism, pacifism's supposed victories are myths, built on historical revisionism that argues the role of armed struggle. And he reviews 20th century history to expose the contradictions of the pacifist posture, the costs of its continued practice, and its fundamental ineffectiveness in accomplishing its purported transformative mission. So he takes, for example, the Jewish experience in Nazi Germany, where pacifism was practiced and it was a catastrophic failure. Churchill says in the 1930s, German Jewish communities employed a range of pacifist forms of countering the implications of Nazism. But They offered virtually no physical opposition to the consolidation of the Nazi state. And even Orthodox Jewish leaders counseled social responsibility as the antidote to the cultural poison. And they were really hoping to avoid exacerbating conditions or alienating the German people. Some even entered into cooperative relations with the SS Jewish Affairs Bureau, attempting to manipulate the political climate from inside through, let's call it, active passivity, and that's spreading influence or modeling moral behavior to, once again, a brutish, cancerous poison, right? This is what Churchill calls a passive accommodation, and it was so entrenched that Jewish leaders took their people quietly and nonviolently, first into the ghettos, and then onto the trains, evacuating them to the east. Armed resistance was deemed irresponsible, perhaps even immoral, and the result is the Nazis' final solution proceeded with chilling efficiency. Pacifism actually helped it speed up. And even the Jewish Sonderkommandos, who were forced to drag gas bodies to the crematoria, well, they attempted to rationalize their accommodation as resistance because it temporarily ensured their survival. Now, Churchill cites Bruno Bettelheim, a former concentration camp inmate, who said even small-scale armed resistance could have disrupted the genocide, because in the Soul Revolt of the 12th Sonderkommandos at Auschwitz, 70 SS members were killed and a crematorium was destroyed. Bettelheim argued that the loss of an SS with every Jew arrested would have noticeably hindered the functioning of the police state. Yet, the inertia of pacifist principles prevented such actions. So what did end up stopping the Nazis, right? Well, it wasn't pacifism. Churchill says that the final solution was halted solely by the massive application of armed force against Germany by external powers, not some sort of nonviolent intervention or shame globally. Even the trial of SS Colonel Adolf Eichmann, written about by Hannah Arendt in The Banality of Evil, well, even to get him, that required armed action by an Israeli paramilitary unit in 1960. And for Churchill, this only underscores that the pacifist principles would have let him leap into the grave laughing at his crimes. So, this history reveals nonviolence as a catastrophic failure, with only the most extremely violent intervention by others saving Europe's Jews from total extinction. From here, he moves on to another example of this kind of nonviolent revisionist myth, and that's the anti-Vietnam War movement. So pacifist organizers, they claim that their movement forced Lyndon Johnson from office, that it impaired the U.S. military through draft resistance, and it ended the war early through solidarity with the Vietnamese. Now, Churchill says that it was actually the Hawks, not the Doves, who ousted Lyndon B. Johnson. They were frustrated by his ineffective prosecution of the war. And after General Westmoreland claimed the enemy's ability to fight was broken, well, the Vietnamese executed the Tet Offensive in 1968, exposing U.S. vulnerabilities and hubris. Now, the right wing, he says, cut its losses with Johnson. And in the next election, the anti-war candidate, his name was Eugene McCarthy, he says he was never really a serious contender, and they just got in someone else from the right, and that was Richard Nixon. Now, this was all because of the Vietnamese offensive, not the parades in the American streets, that created this change. And as for draft resistance, yeah, Churchill says it didn't cripple the U.S. military. Of the estimated 1 million offenders, the draft dodgers, only 0.3% went to prison. Most of them remained in a comfort zone, with basically 80,000 of them exiling themselves to Canada, he says, where they faced the penalty of being lonely. The military's real impairment came from the rapid disintegration of morale among U.S. combat troops after 1968 as a result of the effectiveness of Vietnamese armed resistance. Now, what happened is this led to mass refusal to fight, substance abuse, and even officer assassination. Yeah, some of these are tactics that any American pacifist would disavow, but of course they were far more effective at ending the war. And then, of course, he goes on to this moral contradiction here, claiming that nonviolent solidarity somehow ended the Vietnam War early. And Churchill says that the anti-war movement rapidly dissipated after its first real casualties at Kent State in 1970. And by 1973, when Nixon suspended the draft, all this principled opposition evaporated. And the war just continued for 2 more years with the U.S. support, right? And this cost hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese lives. There was no mass anti-war movement, nonviolent or otherwise, by the time the war ended in 1975. So what he's saying is that once out of personal jeopardy from the draft, the claims for universal pacifism evaporated, making these beliefs a personal shield that's donned and then discarded, right? It's for personal use, not principled use. So the Jews in Germany and anti-Vietnam War, these are both examples, Churchill argues, along with Gandhi's India, where he brings up that the post-independence violence and bloodshed kind of undermine all the claims of nonviolent triumph. Well, this shows that pacifists habitually revise historical fact to offset their doctrine's glaring practical deficiencies. They cherry-pick examples shorn of broader context and the violence of surrounding events that actually helped create the change. Part 3. Pacifism as racist. Churchill says pacifism is objectively racist. He contends that pacifism displaces massive state violence onto people of color both outside and inside the mother country, rather than absorbing any real measure of it themselves. And Churchill points to this paradox where many North American pacifist luminaries like David Dillinger, Joan Baez, and Noam Chomsky, well, they advocate absolute domestic nonviolence while supporting the most powerful expressions of armed resistance abroad, such as the National Liberation Front in Vietnam. So this, he argues, is a blatant accommodation to state power, rationalized by professions of personal and principled pacifism. So this is really a not-in-my-backyard approach to violence, where it is relocated to a poorer, browner backyard. And Churchill says white radicals rely on the armed struggle of non-whites in external colonies or internal colonies like black ghettos or indigenous communities. And this is to weaken the state while they prefigure a post-revolutionary society from their comfort zone. So Churchill sees this as a form of victim blaming under the guise of anti-racism. So yeah, pacifism as racism. This is where the fortress's violence is used by elites who virtuously and defensively claim allegiance to the marginalized while shoring up the fortress's walls. So they're maintaining the status quo in order to be properly placed for leadership in the future society. Part 4. Pacifism as suicidal. So our final point for this episode is that pacifism is suicidal. Churchill inverts Emiliano Zapata's dictum, "It is better to die on one's feet than to live on one's knees." Pacifism, he argues, actually posits the proposition that it is best to die on one's knees and seek to achieve this result as a matter of principle. So pacifists kneel, inviting the state's violence while claiming to resist it. Churchill says this suicidal pathology may stem from a sublimated death wish or a gambler's neurosis. This is a desire to risk everything and win, or a desublimated death wish, which is akin more to like just walking out in front of a bus. And he links this to repressed guilt neurosis, and says that it's probably tied to the racism that we just discussed. So pair this repressed guilt around racism with the delusional belief that passivity is somehow pro-life, and you really end up with a suicidal cocktail. And Churchill kind of punctures this pacifism as pro-life stance with the Jewish example that we previously discussed, where he said the inertia of pacifist principles led millions to their deaths, their passivity playing directly into the hands of their executioners. Even when targeted for systemic elimination, a pacifist's commitment to nonviolence prevents conversion to armed self-defense, making them complicit in their own destruction. So yeah, the fortress we purportedly want to dismantle, the state here, it thrives on this pacifist surrender. Churchill argues that this pathology is deep-seated, superficially self-serving, and socially approved, making it supremely resistant, indeed virtually impervious to mere logic and moral suasion. Conventional critique here, or even dialogic argument, well, it fails because pacifists hunker down behind principles that lack validity, viability, and utility. Now, all of this, of course, harkens back to our last episode where Richard Rorty comments on the progressive liberal being anti-cruelty without ever being able to really define or answer exactly why. They just start promulgating circular arguments. Now, Churchill, looking at this kind of resistance to validity, viability, and utility, suggests that it borders on the theological. It's akin to fundamentalist dogma, codifying religious symbology and mythology as political ideology. So, yeah, your political beliefs are religious, appearing nonsensical to anyone not indoctrinated. Okay, thank you for joining me for this one. This can all be a little unsettling because where do we go next, right? So I'm going to release a second episode soon covering Churchill's proposed remedy or solution. And yeah, there's kind of a practice that he says might be able to break through this delusion. Now, we're also going to add in some current day events and critiques and bring in other thinkers to help broaden this conversation a bit. But once again, thank you for joining me. And until next time, this is Ryder Richards with Let Us Think About It.